So I'm Ken Smethers. I'm an associate professor at the Wharton School as well as a visiting scholar here at AEI. And today's topic is why Social Security reform is very much alive. You hear in the press a lot that Social Security reform is now dead. And as President Bush pointed out in his State of the Union address, the problems haven't gone away, and so they still have to be dealt with. And so we're going to have what we call a special conversation today with Chuck Blahous. We call it that because everybody knows he's the point person in the administration that works on this issue. I think Karl Rove referred to you as the rabbi that they consult on all matters of Social Security. And so he really is the chief guy, and it's a great honor to have him here today to talk to us. He was appointed as Special Assistant to the President for Economic Policy in 2001, and then appointed by President Clinton, as you know, to be Executive Director of the 2001 Social Security Commission, the Commission to Strengthen Social Security that was co-chaired by Senator Moynihan and Richard Parsons, CEO of Time Warner. Before that, Chuck served as Policy Director for Senator Judd Gregg, where he worked on the National Commission for Retirement Policy. And before that, he was a legislative director for Senator Alan Simpson, and he staffed the President's Bipartisan Commission on Entitlement and Tax Reform. He holds a PhD, fortunately not in economics, but in quantum chemistry. Big overlap with Social Security, and yeah, that's right. It's a little easier, and he has also a degree from Princeton. And so the format of today is we're going to let Chuck go for 30 minutes or so, with some flexibility there, and then we'll open up for some Q&A, no more than about a half hour of that. Okay, so Chuck.
Thank you very much. Actually, in one respect, I guess quantum chemistry was easier. It only took me 4 years to get my thesis done in that field. Actually, Kent, I appreciate very much the kind introduction and also your arranging this today. Been a great fan of your work and your insights and scholarship on Social Security over the years. You did leave out one of my qualifications that I received this week. I was named in the Washington Post as the lost cause of the week this week, largely in relationship to this very talk. So thank you, Dana Milbank, wherever you are. I haven't been in Washington so long that I don't still occasionally, on that rare occasion when I find my name in the paper, tear out the clip and send it to Mom and Dad, but I haven't sent that one along yet. But I will say, and I'm very appreciative to AEI for putting this forum together. And I'm well aware that many a very distinguished scholar and expert on Social Security has spoken in this room and before many of you, and I'm very humbled at having the opportunity to join in that procession. I will say, I will lay claim to one thing, which is I think that due to some recent training I received, I am uniquely qualified to diagnose whether, in fact, Social Security reform is, in fact, very much alive. My wife and I are currently, any week now, expecting our very first child. And part and parcel of our preparations for this wonderful event is that we go off every weekend to birth classes and all sorts of other exciting classes. And one of the ones that I recently took was a class on child safety and infant CPR. And so I've received this very rigorous training on how to detect signs of life. They give these little plastic gray baby mannequins, and I've been taught how to put my ear close to them and listen for breathing and tap on the feet and check for circulation. So if there's anyone who's qualified to tell you why Social Security in great detail is very much alive, and I'm definitely the person to do it. For my own edification and to some degree for my own entertainment, prior to coming over here, I did a Google search. And in that Google search, I simply typed in the words Social Security dead to see what came up. And then I did a follow-up search where I typed in Social Security alive to see what came up. I'm a little disappointed to have to report to you that dead beat alive by a count of about 44 million hits to 23 million hits. But it was an instructive process nevertheless. What I found particularly instructive about it was the nature of the pieces that came up when I did that search. At the date that I undertook it, on the very first page of HITS, there was a story in which it was said that the president's proposal was a dead horse, that the effort was doomed, that Republicans were complaining about the, quote, mishandled rollout of Social Security. And what struck me about that particular piece was not so much the content, but the dateline. The dateline was January 19th, 2005. And if you will remember, the rollout of the President's Social Security Initiative actually took place on February 2nd last year at the State of the Union address. It was there that the President went before the country and talked in great detail about the nature of the challenges facing Social Security, their roots in our changing demographics, and he put forward a lot of specifics about how to design and implement a system of voluntary personal accounts. He also talked a little bit about the various things that had to be done in order to deal with the system's impending solvency shortfalls. And he listed a number of measures that he'd be willing to consider, whether they're proposed by Republicans, Democrats, or independents, to bring the system back on track from a fiscal perspective. So we see that even before that rollout occurred, there was already a tenor of the reporting on the issue. And that, of course, is something that is part and parcel of my job. It's a hazard to the profession. You're always going to read things like this, and you learn to become somewhat inured to it after a while. Let me give you a few more quotes. Another article said the plan was, quote, in trouble. Another article, quote, struggling for support. Those were from the New York Times and Washington Post, respectively. Another one said the president, quote, failed to sell the American people on his plan. That was another Washington Post piece. A key Democratic legislator quoted as saying that reform was dead in a Bloomberg article. Another key Democratic leader saying the proposal was dead in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Now, what's significant about all of these articles? The datelines of these various pieces were, respectively, March 2nd, March 19th, March 31st, April 5th, and April 23rd. Now, if you'll recall last year, the president outlined the nature of the problem on February 2nd and discussed a number of possible ways to deal with the program's impending solvency shortfall. He attempted to give people some room and some cover to develop different proposals for addressing solvency. And then later, to advance the discussion, he came forward with a specific proposal of his own to deal, at least in part, with the solvency problem, modeled on a reform idea that had been put together by Robert Posen. And he did that on April 28th. That was the date that he first came forward and said, here's a specific idea for starting the solvency discussion. And so even prior to April 28th, we're reading a lot of pieces saying this isn't going anywhere, implacable opposition, can't be done, et cetera, et cetera. Now, my point in describing these articles is not to take issue with or in any way criticize the particular vantage point represented in the reporting, but simply to note that if you work on Social Security, as I do, and if you are setting about the problem of how to bring a bipartisan consensus together to deal with Social Security solvency, you learn over time to look a little bit past the scorekeeping of the hour and the reporting of the football game of the hour. You learn to understand that in order to understand where we really are on Social Security and what the real prospects are for legislative action, you have to look a little bit more deeply, look at the fundamentals of the issue, the dynamics of the discussion of the issue, and what the public is telling us and what legislators are telling us about the prospects for going forward. So let me say a little bit about those various issues in turn. First of all, obviously the most relevant set of considerations is simply the substantive realities facing the Social Security program, because they, after all, are what are going to guide what we eventually do on Social Security. Now, about the substantive realities, there's really no significant disagreement, at least not among the nonpartisan scorekeeping agencies. Last year, we had a Social Security trustees report, and they said in the 2005 report released in March of last year that Social Security and Medicare are not currently on a sustainable path under their current financing arrangements. And this was the warning that they issued in 2005. It echoed the warning they issued in 2004, which in turn repeated the warning in 2003, et cetera, et cetera. There's been remarkably consistent language in each of the trustees' reports about the nature of the Social Security problem throughout not only the Bush administration, but through the prior administration, the Clinton administration. Now, the Congressional Budget Office, they also have a model for projecting Social Security's future. And it differs in some particulars from the trustees' model. The trustees are the arbiters of the system's solvency, but CBO has their own independent model, and they look forward to see what we can expect from the program as well. And of course, those two models differ in some degree on the particulars of the projections. But qualitatively, they're saying exactly the same thing. The Congressional Budget Office says in their long-term outlook, this program is not on a sustainable course. In fact, in their long-term outlook on Social Security, they took pains to say that even if revenues wind up being significantly higher than now projected, and even if benefit expenditures wind up being considerably lower than now projected, they still anticipate that there will be an enormous gap in the program extending into the foreseeable future. Now, that's a very important point, because what the Congressional Budget Office is saying there is very much the same thing that the trustees tell us every year. There is sometimes a seductive idea that takes shape in the public discussion of Social Security, which is to hope that somehow the problem might fade away on its own, that maybe this is a function of pessimistic projections, maybe the problem will correct itself. Well, each year, the trustees put together a full-scale sensitivity analysis. They do a stochastic analysis as well. And what they do, and it's all publicly put out every year, is they take all of the projections for Social Security, all of the different factors that go into that crystal ball, and they tweak and push and pull on them to see what happens. And as you might imagine, there are a lot of factors that go into these projections. Projections for productivity growth, or real wage growth, or immigration, or mortality, or fertility, or inflation, or interest rates. All these things are part of the crystal ball. And what happens, they find, when you tweak and push and pull and play around with those projections and look at the results, you find that no matter what you do to them, you still have basically the same problem. In fact, the stochastic analysis shows, in the latest trustees report, a 97.5% probability that the program will enter permanent and growing annual cash deficits no later than 2022. Their intermediate estimate is 2017. But even if everything breaks in one direction, and everything breaks in the direction of extending the program's fiscal health, we get an extra 5 years out of the program's annual cash surpluses, and then we have growing deficits after that. People sometimes talk about risk in the Social Security debate. Here you have a system that has a 2.5% chance, according to the trustees, of having cash surpluses out beyond 2022. So clearly that's not something that we want to bank on. And it's not just the trustees and the Congressional Budget Office that are telling us this. You go to the General Accounting Office. They say, in even more stark terms, that we have a significant problem and it's not going away. In fact, Comptroller General David Walker frequently will point out that the real financing shortfall in Social Security is significantly larger than you would understand simply by looking at the actuarial balance calculation. And about that, he's absolutely right. And out beyond the government scorekeeping agencies, if you go around to the scholars here at the American Enterprise Institute, or at the Cato Institute, or the Heritage Foundation, or the Concord Coalition, or even the experts at the think tanks wherein work the most vociferous opponents of our policy prescriptions, you find consistently in all of their publications a recognition that we have a real problem, it's not going away, and it's going to require legislative correction to deal with it. There's a lot that I find that I don't agree with in the papers of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, but I'm always pleased to find that embedded in their papers is usually a restatement of the view that this is a real problem and it's going to have to be dealt with. So about the reality of the problem and the substantive imperative that is going to require Social Security reform to take place, there really is no significant disagreement. And the reasons for that is that so much of the future is a function of things that have already happened. The baby boomers have already been born. They are heading into retirement in 2008, just 2 short years away. And when that happens, the ratio of people paying into the system relative to those withdrawing benefits from the system is going to begin to drop very dramatically. We're going to have a lot more people in retirement during and beyond the baby boomers. They're going to live a lot longer, and as a consequence, the current system is not on a financially sustainable path. Moreover, what all these experts continue to say is that this is a problem that is best dealt with now. They persistently say delay is costly. The earlier we act, the better off we're going to be. The more possible it will be to spread the effects of change in a way that is equitable and fair to different generations and cohorts. So that's the substantive situation. Now let me say a little bit about the dynamics of the debate as they have unfolded over the last 10 to 15 years and what they tell us about the likely future of the Social Security discussion. Let's go back to the early 1990s. We had the Kerry Danforth Commission. Now that commission was appointed by President Clinton, and it was a bipartisan commission appointed largely at the behest of Senator Bob Kerrey, Democrat from Nebraska. and it was co-chaired by Republican Senator Jack Danforth. And that commission was charged with making recommendations for bringing the federal government's entitlement programs to a sustainable course. Now, that commission was unable to agree on how to do that. But the two co-chairs came forward and said, we're going to put a plan on the table. And it's a plan to deal with all the entitlement programs and specifically included recommendations for dealing with Social Security. Now, I won't go in through all the details of the Social Security proposal, but there are two things that I would ask you to remember about the Kerry Danforth proposal. One is that they said we needed to make concrete and explicit changes to the Social Security benefit formula to put it on a sustainable path going forward relative to projected revenues. And they recommended, in part to help shield beneficiaries from the effects of these necessary changes, they recommended the introduction of personal accounts into Social Security. Now, after the Kerry Danforth Commission disbanded, there was an advisory council convened by President Clinton. Technically, actually, it was convened by Secretary of HHS, Donna Shalala. That advisory council was charged with making recommendations to restore Social Security's future to one of long-term balance. Now, that council could not agree on how to do that. They split into factions, and they could not agree on unified Social Security recommendations. But they did agree on certain unanimous points. One was that we needed to fix the system in such a way so that its financial condition did not deteriorate simply because of the passage of time. Now, what did they mean by that? What they meant was that we should not repeat the mistakes of the 1983 reforms. There were a lot of good things done in 1983, a lot of constructive things done in 1983, but there were some mistakes made as well. And one of the mistakes was to declare that the system had been made solvent when it had actually not been placed on a sustainable path. What the 1983 reforms did was to create an outcome where we had large near-term surpluses, followed by even larger and boundlessly growing long-term deficits. And a consequence of the nature of that fix was that almost immediately after the 1983 reforms were instituted, we had a trustees report in 1985 showing that the system was heading out of balance again. And the point of the advisory council is that if we're going to look our children and grandchildren in the face and tell them we've done something to fix Social Security, we can't have a system where every year that passes the program gets deeper and deeper into a bigger hole. That does not constitute reform. So the advisory council said we should not do that this time around. We should have a sustainably solvent Social Security system. They made another unanimous recommendation, and that was that we begin to move to a system of partial advance funding of Social Security. Now, what is implicit in that recommendation? What's implicit is that they didn't believe that the current system was effectively being advance funded through the current trust fund structure. You don't recommend reforming the system to move to partial advance funding if you think that partial advance funding is already occurring. So clearly they agreed that that wasn't happening under the current trust fund structure, and we needed to have a reform in place that would accomplish that. Now, they couldn't agree on how to do that. They split into three factions, and two of those factions said you should do it through personal accounts, and a minority of the commission said you should do it through government-directed investment in the equities market. However, the majority of the council repeated the two core recommendations of Kerry and Danforth to make concrete and explicit changes to Social Security's benefit formula to get it off of its unsustainable course, and to also create a system of personal accounts. Now, throughout the late 1990s, we saw a proliferation of different approaches and different plans that built off of this work that had been done. The Center for Strategic and International Studies convened a bipartisan commission. It was co-chaired by Senator Judd Gregg, my former boss, John Breaux, Jim Colby, Charles Stenholm. And they put forth bipartisan recommendations, which again repeated those two core elements: progressive and concrete and explicit changes to the benefit outlay structure of Social Security and the introduction of personal accounts. And there was a whole series of proposals that came out in Congress in the late 1990s, proposals by Al Simpson, and Pat Moynihan, and John Kasich, and Nick Smith, and Jim Colby, and Charles Stenholm. A whole large number of proposals came forward, and they differed on their details, but they had in general the same two elements at their core. Now, when the Bush administration came in 2001, this was the situation we inherited. There had been a growing bipartisan consensus among experts and people who put forth plans to build reform around these two basic elements. And when the Bush administration came in, we appointed our own bipartisan commission. And it was co-chaired by Democratic Senator, now the late Democratic Senator, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and a very equally able and equally remarkable man, the Republican co-chair, Dick Parsons. And it was a great privilege of mine to serve as executive director for that commission, to work with Ken, to work with Lee, and to work with a number of the really remarkable people who served there. But that commission, again, put forth multiple proposals for dealing with Social Security. And of the proposals they put forward that were sustainably solvent, they were once again anchored on those two basic elements: progressive changes to the benefit structure to put it on a sustainable path, and the introduction of personal accounts funded, at least in part, by a portion of workers' payroll taxes. Now, what is interesting about the debate as it has unfolded over the last couple of years is that obviously there has been a tremendous amount of vigorous and impassioned public discussion about Social Security. And it would be easy to get the misimpression from the nature of the debate over the last couple of years that somehow this growing and solidifying bipartisan expert consensus on how to deal with Social Security had somehow fragmented and fallen apart. But in fact, the opposite is the case. If you go even today to the Social Security Administration webpage, www.ssa.gov, for those who don't know where it is, you can find a link to a link for the research and policy arm of the department, and link from there to the office of the chief actuary, and link from there to the actuarial memoranda, and then from there to the solvency memoranda. You will find a lengthy list of proposals, many of which were introduced in the last couple of years. You'll find proposals by Bob Posen, proposals by Sam Johnson and Jeff Flake, proposals by Chuck Hagel, and a broad variety of other people. And those proposals consistently are anchored upon those two basic elements: personal accounts and progressive changes to the benefit structure to put it on more of a sustainable course. And in fact, that trend has continued even up to the time of this talk. The last major bipartisan proposal that was introduced came out in December of 2005. And it was a collaborative effort by Jeff Liebman of the Clinton administration, Andrew Samwick of the Bush administration's Council of Economic Advisors, and Maya McGinnis of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, and now a new mother again for the second time. And once again, that proposal contained those two core elements: personal accounts and progressive benefit changes. Now, I don't want to gloss over the very real differences between all of these proposals that have been put forward. They're all different. They all have personal accounts of different sizes. In some of them, the personal accounts are mandatory. In some of them, they're voluntary. In some of them, they're funded entirely by worker payroll taxes, and others bring in additional revenue to fund the personal accounts, sometimes requiring an add-on contribution. They all have different types of progressive benefit changes to fix the system's finances. So they're all different in their details. But what's less important than their differences is the fundamental similarity of approach at their core. The bipartisan experts are telling us over and over again that personal accounts should be part of the answer, and that we should make progressive benefit changes to the current Social Security system's outlay benefit formula to bring it to a sustainable path. Now, obviously, in a technical sense, this is not the only way that you can fix Social Security. It is certainly possible to fix Social Security in a way that does not include the personal accounts, and moreover, to do it in a way that is sustainably solvent. There is a proposal that does that. The Diamond-Orzag proposal does that. It's an honest proposal. It's an honestly accounted proposal. It's a proposal that is built around the self-consistent assumptions of the Social Security trustees. I think that most people who looked at the proposal would say it was a praiseworthy and very meticulous effort. My point here is not to critique or analyze that proposal in any way, but simply to point out it is possible to have a sustainably solvent solution. In this particular case, the way that that proposal is sustainably solvent is by implementing a series of sort of automatically reconfigured adjustments that will keep the system in sustainable balance out over the long term. It has a multitude of provisions to do that, some on the benefit side, others on the revenue side. To take one example, the current payroll tax is 12.4%. This proposal would gradually cause that to go up, eventually over 15% within the actuary's valuation period, and there would be a mechanism in the plan that would allow that and cause that to continually readjust and go upward in order to keep the system in balance over the long range. So you can do it. You can do it with changes on the benefit side, changes on the revenue side. My point about this proposal, without condemning the proposal or the effort that went into it in any way, is simply to note that that approach has not attracted any support, and there's no signs it's likely to attract any support within the halls of Congress. There are no legislators who are lining up to do a plan like that. consistently, legislators from both sides of the aisle who are willing to put their names on proposals do it with proposals that have this other form that most of the proposals have been introduced in for the last several years. So, to summarize, we have a clear substantive imperative to deal with the problem, and we now have about a dozen years' worth of history telling us what are going to be the likely components of any bipartisan solution on Social Security. Now, let's talk a little bit about what happened over the last year, what we in the administration accomplished, what we have yet to accomplish, and also what the public attitudes are telling us about how to move forward. I think it's fair to say that we did make significant headway on explaining and increasing public understanding of the nature of the problem on Social Security. NBC did a poll in May 2005, and they asked people, how much financial trouble is Social Security in? 14% of respondents said it's in crisis, 39% said it's in serious trouble, 36% some trouble, 8% not in trouble at all. Well, if you add the serious trouble and some trouble categories, that's 75% of the respondents saying the program's either in serious trouble or some trouble. That's basically consistent with what the experts are saying. AP did a poll the same month, May 2005. Do you think that it's likely the Social Security program is going to run out of money? 70% said yes, we think it will at some point. Again, that's very consistent with what all the expert reports are telling us. Now, what's notable about the survey information is that the public is not saying, we understand there's a problem in some abstract sense. You can deal with it some other day, you can deal with it in 20 years, 30 years, deal with it in some small, delayed, incremental fashion, and we'll be happy. Repeatedly, they say exactly the opposite. As one example, Gallup poll, December 2005. How important is it to deal with Social Security in the next year? 76% said either extremely important or very important. And this is the next year. This is 2006. That's what they're telling us. And that's not even a particularly high number for that type of survey. The public has consistently said, we understand that this is a big problem. We care about Social Security. We want people to act on Social Security. It's not sufficient to just say no. We want you to act, and we want you to act soon. We get it. We get the fact that delay is very costly, and it's not in our interest. Now, what have we not succeeded in doing yet? Well, clearly, we have not succeeded in developing a bipartisan consensus for a specific reform proposal. One analogy that I sometimes make when I talk about this to colleagues is to compare Social Security reform to a car. The public knows they need a new car. They know they can't keep driving the old car. And we went out there. We didn't go out there with a whole car. We didn't go out there with a car that had all the bells and whistles and features and said, here's the complete car, all the wonderful features it's got. What do you think? Do you want to buy that? I think what we did was more analogous to going out with a framework of a car, kind of a chassis of a car. And we said, what do you think of this basic framework? And if you like that basic framework, then we'll put in some of the other features and bells and whistles according to the consensus with Congress. And I think what the opposition did is they went out and they slapped a warning label on that framework. And they said, beware. We're not sure this thing is safe to drive. So be concerned about this. Ask these questions. We have these problems, these concerns. And I think the public read that warning label and they said, okay, we want to think about that. Now, what's significant about that is, first of all, the public didn't get out of the market. They didn't say, all right, we won't get a new car. They keep saying, we need a new car, we're still shopping. That they understand. And equally importantly, they didn't go out and say, well, we want to buy this other car instead. They're still looking around and saying, we're not sure what car to buy. We know we need something. We're not sure what it is. So just because they haven't settled in and said, this is the car we want, does not necessarily mean that that is the approach they don't want to go in down the road. Now, the evidence of this is very clear when you look at specific measurements of public attitudes that compare people's reaction to specific ideas versus overall anxieties about general consequences of reform. Let me give you an example of that. In June 2005, the New York Times did a survey, and they went out and they asked people, what do you think of this idea to fix Social Security, and that idea, and the other? And it had the usual grab bag of possibilities: raise the retirement age, raise taxes, all of that stuff. And one of the things they asked was, suppose you had a system of benefit growth where people on the low-income end could have benefits that grow with wage inflation, which is generally a faster rate of growth than prices. And for moderate to high earners, they would have benefits that grew somewhat more slowly, somewhere between price inflation and wage inflation. And through this slower rate of benefit growth on the higher end, we would address system solvency in some way. What do you think of that idea? 59% said we like it, 35% said they don't. Now, that is significant because that was actually a higher level of support than any other provision that was asked about in that survey, with one exception, which was raising the cap on taxable wages. And you have to put an asterisk next to that exception because that particular counter-proposal wouldn't achieve nearly as much from a fiscal perspective as the progressive benefit growth that was described in the June survey. And so what the public is saying when reform proposals are correctly described, that they're very receptive to these basic ideas. Now, where do the anxieties come in? The anxieties come in when you ask questions in a different way. You ask people about benefit cuts, for example. Do you favor benefit cuts? No, I'm not in favor of benefit cuts. Because when people hear benefit cuts, they definitely get confused. They think you're talking about cutting from current levels, cutting from the protection that Social Security offers today. There is not wide understanding out there that when the term benefit cuts is used, it's often used to refer to rates of benefits payments and tax levels and tax burdens way out into the future that are far higher than we are shouldering today. And you can see that in the results. Let me give you an example. CNN USA Today in April 2005 asked people, do you think that your benefits will be cut by the president's proposal? And 53% said yes, 38% said no. So 91% expressed an opinion. About 3/5 of those thought their own benefits were going to be cut. Now, if you think about that, there's no possible way that can be true. The president's proposal doesn't make any changes to benefits for anyone in that survey who is now in retirement. Wouldn't change benefits for anyone in that survey who was near retirement, retiring before 2012. Wouldn't change benefits for anyone in that survey who is disabled now. Wouldn't change benefits for anyone in that survey who would become disabled in the future. And in fact, if you take all the people who are retired from 2012 and beyond, anyone who winds up in the bottom 30% of the wage distribution, they would get full wage indexation under the president's proposal, which is a far higher rate of benefit growth over the long term than the current system can actually sustain. So for these people, if you actually compare them to what the current system could give them, not only are they getting more than people are getting today, but more than the current system can pay them. You add that all up and you realize that it cannot possibly be the case that 53% of the respondents in that survey were correct to fear that their benefits were going to be cut. A similar factual misperception exists on the financing side. They asked, Washington Post had a poll last year, also in June. Do you think the president's proposals would or would not improve the program's long-term financial stability? And 63% said, no, I don't think so. Well, clearly that's another factual misperception. Even the harshest and most prolific critics of the president's Social Security proposals do not allege that they have a net negative effect on the program's long-term financial stability. Even if you go to the papers of the Center on Budget, and again, we would strongly disagree with all these numbers, and we'd strongly disagree with the metrics that are used to measure our proposals' effects on long-term stability. But even those proposals do find a positive movement in terms of the proposal's effects, even if you're just taking the partial elements of proposals that we put out last year and assuming that that's all we do and that we don't implement the president's vision for an entire solvency fix. So clearly, both with respect to benefit levels and with system financing, there is a generalized anxiety out there about what might be the consequences of reform that simply does not jive with people's attitudes towards specific measures that we can take to fix the system. Now, what does that mean? That means we could probably be doing better than we are and could do more in the future to help people connect the dots. There are a lot of criticisms that are thrown around about personal account proposals and about our reform proposals in particular. I have joked with people in the office that I never know when I wake up in the morning whether I'm going to read that personal accounts are in some way going to exacerbate global warming, or whether they're going to cause premature hair loss, or whether they've been shown to create incontinence in laboratory rats or something like that. Because you see any and every criticism launched at reform at the same time. And what you often find is that the criticisms come from mutually contradictory directions. And we could probably be doing a lot more to help people understand that if you believe one set of criticisms, you can't believe another. For example, if you believe the Congressional Budget Office, or the criticism based on the Congressional Budget Office study that finds that there's a smaller actuarial deficit than the trustees say, if you're one of those people that says, oh, the trustees are exaggerating the problem, CBO says it's a smaller problem, we don't need to do as much to fix the system, well, then by definition, you cannot also believe a paper by Robert Schiller, which alleged that people who invested in the personal accounts proposed by the president would lose money in large numbers, because those two sets of projections are completely contradictory. One is premised on the idea that the future rate of interest on government bonds will be higher than the trustees say. That's how CBO finds that the trust fund lasts longer. And one is premised on the idea that the rate of interest on government bonds will be lower, and therefore the rate of return on personal accounts will be lower. So if you believe the Shiller paper, you can't believe CBO. If you believe the Shiller paper, you actually think the problem in the current system is much bigger than the trustees are now saying. Now, this isn't to take issue or to criticize any particular set of assumptions or any particular criticism. But the point is there are many of them that simply don't go together, and you can't believe them all at the same time. If you go to the self-consistent assumptions and projections of the Social Security actuaries, you come back to basically our analysis and our view of the effects of reform. Now, before I close, I'd like to say a little bit about why these two elements of reform keep turning up time and time again in all of the Social Security proposals. It's not simply because everyone is stuck in one mindset about how to fix the system. It's because the data about Social Security are very clear about what we need to do to get the system back on track in a fair way. Now, there's generally broad agreement that as we move to fill the hole in Social Security's financial imbalance, that we should try to do it in a way that protects people on the low-wage end from any adverse consequences of reform. That's a core value of the president. That's a core value of many of the people who have looked at this. Now, let's break that down. If you think about it, if you look out in 2075 or 2080, you look at the gap between what is being promised and what is going to come in. About 1/3 of benefits that are promised in the long term are unfinanced. Now think about that. Suppose you just try to confine the changes to the small subset of the population. You would have to take 1/3 of the population and completely cut them off from benefits in order to balance the system. Obviously, no one is going to do that. So the effects of change are going to have to be spread far more broadly than just 1/3 of the population. They're going to have to encompass the majority of the population. Now, those of us who are concerned about the effects of any adverse changes in the solvency area and how they might affect low-wage people have developed proposals to make sure that in reform that low-wage people are treated the best. And in the particular proposal by Robert Posen, he created the fastest rate of benefit growth for the bottom 30% of the wage distribution. Now, there is a clear set of factual parameters in current law that give us reason to care about that. The current Social Security system was designed in 1935, and it was designed for a very different world than the one in which we find ourselves now. It was designed largely with the one-earner couple in mind, where the husband was working, the wife was working too, but she wasn't being paid for it, and it was designed around delivering benefits in an efficient way to the traditional couple, one-earner couple with a non-working spouse. As a consequence, the current system pays much lower returns to two-earner couples, single heads of household, divorced people, and other groups. What is happening over time as our society changes, as our workforce changes, as our family structure changes, the current system's benefit formula is becoming less and less well adapted to deliver benefits to low-income people efficiently, given these changes. In fact, if you actually look out over time, you find a system that is becoming less and less progressive by household income. Specifically, if you look out to, say, 2050, and you say, if you had the current benefit formula and you just stuck with it, you paid full wage indexation to everybody, how much benefit growth would we have on the high income end? How much would we have on the low income end? 2050, the highest household income quintile is being promised benefits under the current formula that are 81% higher after inflation than the highest household income quintile is getting today. The lowest household income quintile is being promised benefits that are only 32% higher in 2050 than the lowest household income quintile is getting today. And the reason for that is that the current system's benefit formula is simply not configured to deliver benefits to the types of households that are going to be low-income households retiring in the future. So what all these experts have concluded from looking at this is to say, wait a second, this makes no sense whatsoever. The current benefit formula drives system costs in the direction of higher payroll taxes, higher burdens on working men and women, higher costs of employment, greater costs of employment. It retards job creation, all the other problems that come from increasing payroll tax burdens. And that increasing payroll tax burden, the increasing cost burden, exists largely because we are delivering benefits under the current system, most of that benefit growth above and beyond inflation, to people on the highest household income end. That makes absolutely no sense. And so all the experts keep coming back and saying we have to do something about the benefit growth above inflation that is going to the highest household income quintile to spare lower wage people the burdens of increased costs. And this is why they keep coming around to formulas like Bob Posen's and others to move the current system's benefit formula away from full wage indexing for everybody and towards one that has progressive benefit growth. Now let me say something about the personal accounts. Obviously, I don't have the time, and I don't want to tax your patience by going too far over time, by giving the full list of reasons why we favor personal accounts. I mean, you've heard them all before. We still believe in them all. We believe in the importance of ownership. We believe in the importance of having a component of the system that is funded as opposed to pay-as-you-go. We believe in the virtues of ownership and inheritability. And we certainly believe that people should have the opportunity to pursue a higher rate of return than they can get under the current system, even recognizing that we cannot say with certainty what those returns will be. Nevertheless, why do we come out and propose personal accounts in the form that we have? Remember, what we have proposed is a system of voluntary personal accounts. The president strongly believes that if you don't want a personal account, you shouldn't have to have one. So if you have a personal account system, you want to have a system that stays roughly in the same degree of fiscal balance, regardless of how many people take the personal accounts. Think about it. If you're relying on the personal accounts exclusively to fix the system finances, then you've got a problem. If you don't make any changes to the traditional system to fix it, then if people don't sign up for the personal accounts, you haven't done anything. Similarly, if you set up the personal accounts as a new financial commitment, as a new entitlement on top of the current system, or something that in effect is going to be a net cost to the system, then you've got a problem too, because then as more and more people sign up for the accounts, you're going to knock the system out of balance. You need a system of personal accounts such that over the long term, if you have a balanced system, the balance of the system is not knocked in or out of balance as different numbers of people sign up for the accounts. The personal account, therefore, is a vehicle for potentially improving the treatment of the worker without being relied upon to either correct or worsen the system's long-term balance. And so when you start with that principle, you realize you have to design the personal accounts in such a way so that what happens is the individual has an opportunity to take some of their future payroll taxes and move it into a personal account. And at the same point that they do that, not at some distant future date, but at the same point when they do that, the current system's unfunded obligations are reduced in approximately an equal extent in present value. And by doing that, you have a system that keeps the system in the same rough level of actuarial balance, regardless of how many people take the personal accounts. So, in sum, we have a set of substantive imperatives. We know we have to fix the system. We know that problem is not going away. We have a clear and solidifying bipartisan expert consensus on the basic elements of reform that need to be a part of a solution. We have clear public attitudes about the necessity of reform. And we also have, not least, a good substantive case for the types of reforms we've put out. And we have the absolute commitment of the President of the United States, which counts for a tremendous amount. The President was asked about this the other day, and he said, I just want to remind people it's not going away. It's not one of those issues, well, if we don't deal with it now, maybe it will fix itself. It gets worse over time, not better. I'm going to continue talking about the problem because I strongly believe that the role of those of us in Washington, one role is to confront problems. That's what we've got to do. He's absolutely right. We do need to deal with Social Security. In one way, shape, or form or other, we will deal with Social Security. I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Chuck. That was fantastic. One of the points that you hit on that I think is a source of a lot of confusion out there is what we even mean by benefit. Because as you pointed out, people close to retirement, in retirement, on the poor end, they're not going to face really any change relative to the current system. But even those who are at the higher end, who are not going to get wage indexing anymore, but something that's a mix of price and wage indexing, they're not getting that benefit cut relative to the current purchasing power of benefits paid today. It's simply relative to the greater benefit that's being promised in the future. And that's a real source of confusion when I talk to people out there that I think you nicely hit upon. Okay, so I've a ton of questions. I won't monopolize my position up here to ask those questions. I'll leave it open to you to ask questions. Only 3 ground rules, however. First, so that the people in the TV audience can hear your question, wait for the roving mic to get to you. And the second thing is just to tell us your name, your organization. And the third is please actually ask a question instead of making a statement. So any questions? Yes, Mike.
Mike Tanner with the Cato Institute. Chuck, what's with this proposal for a commission that showed up in the State of the Union address? It seems to me that given that the last two commissions couldn't reach an actual agreement, Kerry Danforth couldn't actually issue a report because they couldn't get the votes to actually issue it. The chances in this heightened atmosphere of partisanship that you're going to see the Democrats and Republicans come together and sing Kumbaya and come to a sudden realization on what Social Security reform should be in the next year seems slim. So why go down this route?
Well, I appreciate that question. I won't say that I didn't expect a question along those lines when I came here. After we announced the desire to form the Entitlement Commission, I found myself looking over my speech again, trying to come up with various ways to duck that question when it was asked here. Obviously, the precise construction of the commission and the details as to how it's going to be put together, who it's going to be on it, all of that is being discussed. It's being discussed, and those decisions will be made at much higher levels than mine. But I think what it reflects is the President's earnest desire to constantly move this issue forward. Obviously, I often get the question, what would you do differently about reform in 2005 if you had to do it all over again? What will you do differently in 2006? What will you do differently in 2007? As the Social Security policy wonk, I, of course, am not the possessor of the answers to those questions. I'm not the grand strategist. But what I have always said is that, of course, we're always reassessing. We're always doing our best to try to create a climate that makes it more possible for people to come together and solve problems. We cannot compel anyone to come to the table. We can't compel anyone to participate. All we can do is to put our ideas out there and to try to make as benign a climate as possible for people to come forward and discuss possible reforms. I think what the Entitlement Commission proposal shows is the President's latest effort to do that. It's an attempt to advance the ball. The precise shape of it and the precise results of it obviously have yet to be seen, but it certainly reflects that that continued interest in moving the issue forward.
Mike Wyan with BNA. Chuck, largely the debate over Social Security, at least particularly last year, has been those for and those against private accounts. You still see the debate is strictly along those lines.
Well, that's a very good question, and I often ask myself a similar version of that question, which is if things had taken place in a different order, if the discussion on solvency had preceded the discussion of personal accounts and so forth, would things look differently than they now do? I'm not so sure that it would. I think what you find is that inevitably a lot of the people who have put forward these proposals have put them together with both attention to the things that have to be done to restore the system to solvency and the desire to have a better working system, which the personal accounts are there to help accomplish. What I think it's important to remember about the current debate is that even though the personal accounts are very vigorously debated, as I indicated before, we should not leap from that very important and very vigorous debate to conclude that it's necessarily going to be any less vigorous or any less impassioned or any more bipartisan if personal accounts weren't a part of that mix. And I think the evidence of that is the singular lack of support legislatively for proposals that lack the personal accounts. We are frequently asked, would you go along with a proposal that aimed to restore solvency without the personal accounts? And my answer to that is simply this. Obviously, the President supports personal accounts. He'll continue to support personal accounts. We think the personal accounts are the right answer. The question as to what we would do in the face of a legislative effort to create a solvent system without the personal accounts is very speculative and very hypothetical. And there's really very little reason to believe that it would come about simply because if you look at the evidence, if you look at the lack of a reaction to Diamond Orzag, or if you look at the response to Senator Bennett's proposal. Senator Bennett put a proposal together that was based off of the Posen idea of progressive benefit indexing and on personal accounts. And of course, received criticism from those who opposed personal accounts. Senator Bennett made a public offer to take the personal accounts out of the plan and see if he could get consensus behind a plan that achieves solvency without the personal account. And there hasn't been any more support for that idea. So I'm not so sure that the opposition to personal accounts is always directly aimed at the personal accounts per se. Sometimes it reflects a fundamental reluctance to engage on the issue generally. Sometimes it reflects a fundamental reluctance to engage on the solvency questions as well. So I hope that's something of a meandering answer to your question. Ken, can you select?
Alex Pollock of the AEI. When discussing the demographics of Social Security, you talked about the ratio of those paying in compared to the ratio of those receiving, but there's also another ratio which is changing, which is the expected time receiving Social Security for any individual, which is obviously extending as over the last generation, on average, retirement ages are falling and life expectancy is increasing. Aren't there things that could be done, or are there things that could be done as part of the reform to create incentives without necessarily further raising mandatory retirement ages, but to create incentives in the structure of the programs for working longer? HSBC did a global survey, I'm sure you saw a little bit ago, which found that all over the world, the vast majority of people want to keep working in some way past retirement. And wouldn't that be a positive part of a reform program, which hasn't gotten much discussion, in fact?
Well, this is a very, very insightful question. And just the beginning of my answer, I'd like to reinforce your basic point in asking the question. Oftentimes, if you just look at initial benefit levels and where they're going, you can get an understated picture of how much we're actually paying out in future benefits, simply because of the factor you're talking about. People are collecting these initial benefit levels for longer periods of time. And if you were to try to get a picture of how much people are taking out of the system total on a present value basis, many analysts have said that we really need to look at that as well. Not just focus on the initial benefit levels, but look at what we can do to manage the growth of total benefits paid out over a lifetime. Now, you're speaking to an issue that I think is very important and is one that I individually have a great interest in, because the current Social Security system has a number of very bad incentives for labor force participation. Let me give you a couple of examples of them. One of them is that the current system has an actuarial adjustment for early and late retirement. And that actuarial adjustment is designed to equalize the amount of benefits that you get in retirement. So if you retire early, you get a lower benefit because it's expected you'll withdraw benefits for a longer period of time. But the problem with that is that if you only equalize things on the benefit end, you neglect the critical factor that as people keep working, they continue to pay taxes. So effectively, people are working and paying into the system for longer to receive nothing more in additional benefits. And a number of experts have called attention to this as a significant problem and have recommended, in fact, there's a number of proposals that contain recommendations to therefore steepen the penalty for early retirement, increase the rewards for delayed retirement. Others have come up with different variations of this. Like Gene Sturley at the Urban Institute said we should backload our benefits more, increase, maybe not in terms of a pure actuarial adjustment, but find another formula for backloading benefits so that people get significantly more if they retire at a later date. This isn't the only element of the system where this is a problem. Let me give you another example of a senior who wants to work part-time in retirement. This is a sort of thing that from Social Security's perspective we ought to be encouraging. But the current benefit formula, what it does is it goes back early over the course of your career and it looks at all the years that you worked. And it indexes those contributions for wage growth since they took place. So you might have worked in a $10,000 job 30 years ago. And what the system does is it says, well, let's wage index that into today's terms and see how much that would be worth in today's economy with all the wage growth that's taken place since then. What that means is that increases the weight of early earnings years in the benefit calculation. Now, the benefit calculation only counts your top 35 years of earnings. So look at it from the perspective of a senior who wants to work part-time. If they want to take a part-time job, they might wind up taking a job that because of that wage indexation does not even appear in their top 35 years of earnings. So they would be taking a job and paying more money into the system to have no effect on their benefit whatsoever. All these things are very problematic with respect to labor force participation. I don't think it's an accident that by far the vast majority of people who choose to take Social Security benefits pick the age of 62 to take them, because there are a number of reasons why it is currently in their financial interest to do them, and we ought to be looking at all those.
Eric.
Eric Toder, Urban Institute. There was a report released yesterday by the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College, which documents the increasing trend in the private pension world toward shifting toward defined contribution plans and away from defined benefit plans. And there are some indications that more companies are going to freeze their defined benefit plans and substitute 401ks. My question to you is, does that trend in the private world strengthen the case for shifting to Social Security personal accounts in the sense that private sector is pointing out that that's the way to go? Or does it weaken the case in the sense that with defined benefit plans disappearing in the private world, Social Security may become for most people the only source of permanent retirement income?
Well, obviously, if you ask different experts about this, you'll get different answers. I can only give you mine, which I think it very much strengthens the case. And I'll tell you why, for a number of reasons. If you look at the employer-provided defined benefit world, and if you look at Social Security and compare the two systems, you see a lot of very troubling similarities. The things that have caused the big problems in the employer-provided defined benefit world and the things that are causing our problems in Social Security essentially arise from the same sources. The most obvious of those sources is the fact that whether it's a defined benefit pension system or the Social Security system, that they've promised these guaranteed defined benefits to an ever larger number of people, and that relative to the workforce that's putting into whether it's the company or the Social Security system, you've got a bigger burden for the productive capacity of the following workforce to support as the population ages. But beyond the demographic factors that imperil both systems, you have a number of other similarities as well that I believe are really insufficiently remarked upon. Let me give you an example. The defined benefit pension system has often gotten into trouble because it has opaque accounting that overstates the assets that are really in the system and leads to a sense of false security about employers' retirement situation. We have seen over and over again in the employer-provided defined benefit world, you have these employees and they go to work every day and they're told every year, year after year, that your pension is funded or 90% funded or 95% funded. And according to federal laws and regulations, it is. And then the pension plan terminates. And then everyone is shocked to find out that the plan is only 50% funded with respect to the cost of termination. We've seen this in very vivid and painful ways over the last couple of years. People have lost benefits, pension benefits that they were counting on because the system has misled them as to what was really in the system, what assets were really there to pay for benefits. The Social Security system suffers from a very similar problem in that regard. We have a system that really overstates the actual financial health of the system. Trust fund accounting is very problematic in terms of being straight with the public about what is actually involved with paying benefits. The trust fund, if there are assets in the trust fund, they are debt to the rest of the federal government to an exactly equal degree. And to treat it as sort of a net asset, a net pot of money to pay benefits, overstates the actual cash on hand and the actual cash coming in to pay benefits in a way that is going to be a very rude shock to people in 2017 and beyond when the system enters its cash shortfalls. So both systems suffer from this problem of overstatement of assets, understatement of liabilities, and overstatement of the funded capacity and opaque accounting. Moreover, there's another very troubling similarity. In the defined benefit pension system, people have gotten into trouble because they have been either required or heavily incentivized to have all their eggs in one basket. You look at the Enron situation or any of these other plans that went belly up. We had all these people that were invested in the company stock. They didn't diversify, they weren't diversified. When something went wrong with that basket, then they were out of luck. Social Security has a very similar problem. People are not allowed to diversify. They're not allowed to choose investments outside what's the equivalent of the company stock, which is the federal government investing in itself. Everyone is compelled to be having all their eggs in one basket. That exposes them to a tremendous amount of risk as a consequence of their inability to diversify their investments and to have some money that's not under the control of the sponsoring entity. So all these problems lead to similar problems in the defined benefit pension system and in Social Security. And the difficulties that we have seen in the defined benefit pension world are an omen for what is going to come in Social Security if we do not reform the system.
Both have incentives for early retirement.
And both have incentives for early retirement. That's true.
Clark Judge, White House Writers Group, a consulting firm. It seems to me that despite your characterization of the expert consensus, that there's a large rejectionist faction within Washington. Says there's no problem. Paul Krugman would be an example of that, spokesman for it. And that group has received a veto, essentially, on action, and will until there's a proposal specifically in the hopper from the administration. My question is, with the president's endorsement of a commission, does that mean there'll be no bill in the hopper during this administration? Wall Street Journal today, I believe, said that was the case.
That's a very difficult question for me to answer because it really asks me to get into the minds of people and try to analyze their motivations or reasons for not participating in a solution to this point. I will confess to a fair degree of skepticism that that our putting a concrete proposal on the table would result in applause from Paul Krugman. But having said that, we received different counsel from different quarters at different times, and we have done our level best to respond to the sincere concerns and opinions of people on both sides of the aisle. You might imagine, for example, that prior to the State of the Union address last year, we had a decision to make about whether or not to put a full-fledged, detailed proposal on the table, complete proposal on the table, and offer that as an attempt to chart the course of the debate. And you can imagine the arguments on both sides. On the one hand, you want to show leadership and provide cover for people to follow. On the other hand, you don't want to look inflexible or look wedded to one particular way of doing it and closed to other ways of doing it. Most of the counsel that we received from people who were working in bipartisan groups and who were working, and especially also from moderate Democrats, was that it would not be helpful for us to come out straight out of the gate and say, this is our proposal. Because we do live in a polarized environment, political environment, and we need to make sure that we are cognizant of the fact that it's very difficult for someone to come forward across the aisle if we put a specific proposal out there and say, I embrace this proposal, I like it. They're probably going to have to find some way to show that they had an impact on changing or opposing or doing something to change the shape of eventual legislation. Consequently, we were advised by a number of people early on that we could help the most by not identifying a specific thing, whether it was raising the retirement age or price indexation or any of those things as the complete solution to Social Security, not identifying any specific thing as the, quote, administration plan, because naming something that would immediately make that particular policy choice problematic for certain people. But rather, what we were encouraged to do was to create an environment that would make it safe for those sorts of things to be discussed, but give cover for that discussion by the president's declaring his willingness to consider them all. And so the president in the State of the Union address went out there and he basically said, I'm willing to talk about all this. I'm willing to talk about price indexation. I'm willing to talk about this. I'm willing to talk about that. He listed a whole series of proposals. And so if anyone wanted to criticize the proposals, they could take their aim at us. But obviously, what took place over last year was that when we came forward on the specifics on the personal accounts, but not on a full solvency plan, this led to a very vigorous debate over the virtues or perceived lack of virtues in some quarters of the personal accounts. And there were a number of calls for more specifics on solvency. Now, I actually thought that was a very welcome development because you could easily imagine it going the other way, where we came out first with a solvency proposal and not on the personal accounts. Then you create obvious opposition to what we put out on the solvency proposal. And you wind up demonizing a lot of those options. Instead, we produced exactly the opposite. We had calls for more on solvency. And so when we came forward in late April with specifics on the Posen formulation, we could, in a sense, be responding to something that the body politic was wanting, which is all a very long way of saying, who knows? But that was basically the sort of things that went into our thinking.
Lou Enoff, IDPA. Chuck, you mentioned the change in family structure that's affected the benefit formula being somewhat out of kilter these days. I wonder, have you or anyone looked at the fact that with the highest proportion of older poor being women, divorced women or never married women, has anyone looked at the idea of earnings sharing combined with personal accounts as a way to maintain some family structure and yet give people an option of dealing with the problems that accrue to spouses in divorce, particularly women?
Certainly, that has been explored. Dean Sturley of the Urban Institute has done a lot of work looking at that particular option. Obviously, within the White House, we are always looking at every different reform idea under the sun, analyzing it, doing numbers on it, et cetera. The only part that we have put out there in the public space as something we've embraced is the Posen formulation for progressive benefit growth. But that's not to say that other people don't look at these other options and evaluate them. With particular respect to the treatment of women, that's one reason why you want the system in the future, why you want the solution to be a progressive one if possible. You want a solution that has a more progressive benefit formula if you're looking to improve the relative treatment of women going forward. I would also hasten to point out that when we analyze proposals for what they do to ameliorate poverty in old age, what we consistently find is that the inheritable feature of the personal accounts is a great buffer against poverty. Let me give you one example of that. When the commission, the Social Security Commission, did their work, they included, in an effort to try to ameliorate poverty among elderly women, they included a provision to increase the widow's benefit. They also included a personal account proposal. When we got better capacity later to analyze the commission recommendations and found the impact of different provisions in lifting people out of poverty, we actually found that the inheritance potential of the personal account completely dwarfed the impact of the widow's benefit. There's only so much you can do within the traditional system, but having a feature of inheritable personal accounts would be very helpful.
Thank you, Chuck. We really appreciate your time.